Hello everybody, I am Cassidy, I am the Hippie Catholic. Welcome to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe to be a part of the conversation. So I know that self-isolation has been getting a lot of people down. I'm usually an introvert myself, but it's even been getting me down. I don't know if it's just the American in me that like every time I'm told to do something, I'm like, I'm gonna do the opposite. I'm gonna lick every doorknob. I'm starting to feel it a little bit. I wanted to make a video kind of, I guess, offering solutions to cabin fever. You know, besides watching Outbreak. Why are people doing that? I wanted to share some of my favorite podcasts with you guys. I've been wanting to make this video for a long time anyway, so I'm just like, you know, I might as well do it now. These are in no particular order. I just like what I like. I'm indecisive. So the first podcast I'm going to talk about is God is Gray, the podcast. You may know Brenda from God is Gray, the YouTube channel, but she also has a podcast, and her podcast is honestly amazing. It's actually like the first podcast I really got into. Before I listened to the God is Gray podcast, I wasn't like a huge podcast person. She talks a lot about Christianity and sex ed, and she's able to talk about like sex ed in more detail because like YouTube monitors like content like that. It's a really, really great podcast. And it's really, really important because I know that there's a lot of people who grew up without having access to proper sex ed. God is Gray interviews a lot of people who have different opinions than her, so don't let that diversity of opinion throw you off. That's actually something I enjoy about the podcast, but I know some people who've been raised in religious upbringings may be turned off by that. But it really makes for really cool conversations, and exploring and weighing out ethical arguments are essential to healthy spirituality. It be like that. My favorite episodes are Marketing Bad Christian Films with Sarah Hartland, Body Positivity with Faux Porter, Self-Harm and Exorcism, Talking Serial Killers with Tori Telfer, and Stargazing with astrologist Eliza Kelly. The next podcast that I absolutely love is the Magnificast podcast. I've mentioned this podcast before in other videos because I'm just obsessed with it. It's a podcast for left-leaning Christians. The podcast also explores how left-leaning political standing does not necessarily have to separate you from your faith in Jesus. It can actually strengthen your faith in Jesus, and it has for a lot of people. So that's what that podcast is all about. I even recommend it for people who don't consider themselves to be leftists, just because I think that it's good to listen to other perspectives. They talk a lot about the Catholic workers movement, which was founded by Dorothy Day, a socialist Catholic woman activist. And many believe that Dorothy Day will be canonized as a saint, even though even in her lifetime she was being told that, and she was like, no, I'm not going to be canonized, but like she's going to be canonized, like she needs to be. Before listening to the Magnificast podcast, I had heard of the Catholic workers movement, but I did not nearly know as much about it as I do now, thanks to the Magnificast podcast. And my favorite episodes of the Magnificast podcast are Jesus and the Politics of Mammon with Hollis Phelps, Catholic Action in Spain 1968, Magnificast Extra Credit Mary Knew. That episode talked about the radical nature of Mother Mary and her Magnificat. That's where the name came from. The Magnificast is like a play off of the Magnificat, and it really emphasizes how Mother Mary was a peasant girl living in an occupied state, and how the messianic message is really, really radical and countercultural and revolutionary. Another episode that I really like is Black Elk, Colonialism and Lakota Catholicism with Damian Costello, because Nicholas Black Elk is also up for canonization like Dorothy Day. Many already consider him a saint, so pray for Dorothy Day and Nicholas Black Elk to be canonized. We need them. I highly recommend this podcast for politically intersectional Catholics, especially. This third podcast that I'm going to talk about is for all of you horror freaks.
Strong, ash, bone, and sickle. Bleeding saints and forest witches, the past unburied, the books unsealed, the old celebration returning.
This podcast is for those of you who love horror, folklore, and just Catholic stuff. It's not from a faith-based perspective, it's from a historical perspective, so it's great for more skeptical viewers and listeners. The production value is very, very good, so it's a super fun podcast to listen to when you're feeling spooky doing laundry. The hosts have this really great buddy comedy dynamic, and their dialogue is just hilarious. And some of my favorite episodes of this podcast are Ghosts of Purgatory, Ghastly Saint Stories, Possessed Nuns and Holy Demon Acts, and Seances and Scandals. If you love horror and Catholic stuff, spiritually, academically, or both, this is a great spooky podcast for you. I don't think it's too scary because it is coming from like a historical academic lens, but I do want to emphasize that horror is a niche genre and sometimes it just doesn't resonate with everybody, so practice self-care and discretion when consuming media. The fourth podcast that I'm going to talk about today is The Liturgist. And the Liturgist podcast is one of the podcasts that introduced me to other podcasts I love, specifically the Richard Rohr podcast I'm going to talk about in a little bit. I feel like that God is Grey and the Liturgist are two great podcasts to get you into listening to podcasts. And the Liturgist podcast talks about faith, art, and science, and it's very interfaith friendly. Michael Gungor from the band Gungor is one of the producers and one of the hosts, and Lisa Gungor is on the podcast from time to time. I love Lisa Gungor so much. So the other hosts are Science Mike, Hillary McBride, and William Matthews. Their dynamic is so pure, and they all bring like something really, really unique to the conversations that they have. I was actually happy because they just released a new episode today when I'm filming, addressing the COVID-19 crisis, and it's a really, really, really great episode. I highly recommend it for all of you guys that are, experiencing cabin fever. The podcast as a whole is just a great space for those of us questioning our faith or lack thereof. And some of my favorite episodes are Woman, the Most Beautiful Thing I've Ever Seen with Lisa Gungor, Paranormal, that was like their Halloween special, Tabs and Wafers live in Los Angeles, and Not Christian. The Liturgist is an awesome podcast, so please, please, please check out The Liturgist. This next podcast I'm going to be talking about is called Cannabis is Spiritual. This podcast was formerly known as Christian Cannabis, but they did away with the Christian label a few months ago. This podcast, like the name suggests, explores the spiritual uses of cannabis, and it really dives into like different like indigenous spiritual practices that have used cannabis for centuries, and it also dives into the benefits that cannabis use has had for many people. I think that it's an important podcast for people who would like to be more holistically educated on cannabis. It's a great place that removes stigma. I've been in contact with Cannabis is Spiritual, like I think last summer. We were discussing a possible collab in the future. I'm still down for that. I just have to get proper equipment for like video call interviews and stuff. Like if it's able to happen, like I'm down for it. My favorite episodes are Cannabis is Spiritual, that's like the first episode, The Light, Girl Talk, and Cannabis Tract. This next podcast that I'm about to discuss is extremely, extremely important. It's not only just a great podcast, but it is an absolutely essential resource for queer Catholics. It's called Tabard In. Tabard In is a podcast created by Vine and Fig. Vine and Fig is an LGBTQ rights advocacy group for queer Catholics, and it advocates for equal rights within the Catholic Church. And I've talked to Patrick from the podcast over Instagram, and he is such a lovely person. He's been to some of the same churches I've been to, and we were able to talk about a lot of different things. We just had amazing chats on Instagram. Patrick studied to be a priest for years until he realized that joining the priesthood out of fear is not a good reason to join the priesthood. He realized that he was actually called to have a partner, and he married his husband and co-host this year. And his husband is actually a new Catholic convert, so that's really exciting. Some of my favorite episodes are Catholic gay marriage, Bishops say homosexual acts are good now. That episode in particular talks about what happened in the German Synod and like what was going on with like conversations about like sexuality and gender and stuff. and that's an exciting episode. Definitely check that one out. And then also, I love the episode Be Better and the Amazon Synod Explained featuring Massimo Fagoli. It's just a great podcast for queer Catholics and Catholic allies, so I just highly, highly recommend it. It's revolutionary, and as I mentioned earlier, I believe that it's an absolute essential resource for queer Catholics. Patrick and Jacob, if you're ever down for a collab, I am definitely down. All you guys watching this, especially my queer viewers, you all need to check out Tabard Inn. It's so full of God's grace. Go listen to it right now. I mean it. Now, the next podcast I'm going to talk about is Another Name for Everything with Richard Rohr. This podcast is absolutely mind-blowing. It's a wonderful introduction to modern Catholic mysticism. For those of you who don't know, Richard Rohr is a Franciscan priest and author, and he wrote The Universal Christ, What the Mystics Know, and Contemplation in Action. I will be reviewing The Universal Christ soon, so stay tuned for that. Oprah loved it, everybody loves it, and we all know that books are good if Oprah likes it. So my favorite episodes are The Personal is Political, What Do We Do with the Bible and Tradition, Hell, the Devil, and the Afterlife, Miracles, Signs, and Wonders, and Richard Rohr and James Finley on Turning to the Mystics. Richard Rohr is great, honestly, for any spiritual person. As I mentioned before, Richard Rohr actually had an interview with Oprah.
If you had one message, Preacher Rohr, that you want people to gather from the Universal Christ, it is
that the dignity in people and things is inherent and objective and given from the beginning. It's not created by moral behavior. It's universally shared. Like the quote I begin the book with, Ephesians 1. You were chosen in Christ from the beginning, before the world began. So if the notion of the universal Christ helps us to recognize the inherent objective dignity, image of God is our term, Genesis 1, 26, 27, in everything, that the divine DNA is universal. You're at home now. There's nothing to be afraid of.
right.
You're home free. You'll never be lonely again, as I think I try to say in the book.
I'll put a link to that video in the card above because it's a really, really good interview because, I mean, it's Oprah. And his work just resonates with so many people across faiths. His podcast really, really focuses on deconstructing dualistic thinking within the church and society. His work is just really, really important, and I just highly recommend Richard Rohr's podcast. So in my opinion, these are all amazing podcasts, and they're great for anyone who is spiritual, open-minded, and dedicated to social justice. I'm sending love and good vibes to all my viewers and subscribers. I know that this time of isolation sucks, but I think that it's a good time for us to reflect on how we've lived, and I think it's a good time for us to reflect on what's really important. I love and support all of you. Please share your favorite podcast in the comment section below, or just chat about anything because, yeah, social distancing sucks. And also, thank you guys just so much for watching. Please consider supporting me on my Patreon account if you're financially able to do so. As a small creator, I'm currently not monetized, so any donation helps the platform out immensely. If you're not able to donate, that's totally okay. You can still help the platform by liking, sharing, and leaving your thoughts on my videos because that helps the platform grow in diversity. Just thank you so much to my lovely patrons, M, Julia, Derek, Debbie, and Peter. I'm just really, really appreciative for all of you guys, so thank you. Thank you so much for watching. I am Cassidy. I'm the Hippie Catholic. God bless.